Hello and welcome to Reporting In. I'm your host, Malcolm Fleschner. If you haven't seen the show before, this is the TYT Network show dedicated to the topic of investigative journalism, reporting, journalism in general. We talk to reporters often, we talk to others who are involved in the journalism field. We like to get the story behind the story, if such a thing exists. And today on the show, I'm really excited because we're talking to one of the geniuses, the dogged individuals behind Project Censored, and his name is Andy Lee Roth. He's actually the associate director of Project Censored, and I want to make sure I get his CV correctly. He also is a professor of sociology at Sonoma State University and the College of Marin. He coordinates Project Censored's validated independent news program and has co-edited 9 editions of the Censored yearbook, including the most recently released Censored 2019, Fighting the Fake News Invasion. Just came out in October 2018. So Andy, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate you making the time.
Great, it's a pleasure to join you, Malcolm.
Okay, so Project Censored is, our viewers may be unfamiliar with it. I've been monitoring your work for years, and it's, I say dogged because you keep going year after year after year, reporting on the stories that are not covered sufficiently by the mainstream media, and yet they never seem to learn their lesson. So that's why I appreciate that you keep at it. Is that an accurate description of Project Censored? Maybe you could describe better than I can.
Yeah, we were established at Sonoma State University in 1976 and have from the start always been an organization that was closely tied to direct hands-on student education. So there are a number of important media watchdog organizations around the country, many more now than there were when the project was originally founded by Carl Jensen at Sonoma State. But one of the things that distinguishes what we at Project Censored do and how we work is that we've always involved undergraduate, college, and university students in kind of the hands-on vetting and evaluating of the news stories that end up being featured by the project each year in our annual list of the most important but underreported news stories.
And that's the objective of the organization, is to come up with a list every year of what you consider the most underreported stories, the stories that, but important, but that don't get enough coverage, as opposed to, say, Kanye West visiting the White House, which is a story that gets a lot more attention than it warrants, or what any recent tweet by Donald Trump, perhaps. But so these are sort of the flip side of that, which are the stories that maybe should be occupying the headlines and the mainstream media news outlets should be discussing, but they're not. Instead, they're covering Kanye or whatever. So how do you go about this? So you involve students in the vetting process, but how do you figure out what is a story that is insufficiently covered? What are the criteria you use to decide such things?
Yeah. So this is really for us a year-long process. This year that you mentioned, Censored 2019, Fighting the Fake News Invasion, the top 25 stories that are featured in this year's book have been undergoing review in many cases for almost 12 months up to the publication of the book. This year, some 351 students were researching, identifying, and vetting those stories. Each story undergoes what is ultimately, if it makes it into the book, a 5-stage process of review that begins with a student and their faculty mentor at one of the colleges or universities that's affiliated with the project. And they first identify the story and subject it to an initial evaluation of the credibility of the story, the quality of the reporting, and whether that story has received any significant news coverage in the corporate media. It's important to pause here and notice that we at Project Censored don't refer to the mainstream media. We think it's much more descriptive and accurate to refer to what many people refer to as the mainstream media as in fact being the corporate media. And
right.
We could talk more about patterns of corporate ownership and how those shape news content. But anyway, the twin aims of the project that students and faculty all contribute to in this process, year-long process that I'm describing, is one, to hold the corporate media to account when they fail to provide us the kind of news and information that we need to be engaged citizens and informed community members. And second, on the affirmative side, to celebrate and draw wider public attention to the really important and high quality work that's being done by a number of independent news outlets and independent news journalists across the country. So those stories eventually, as they make their way through this 5-stage process that I'm describing, those stories come spring of each year. All the campuses that have participated will look at a ballot that includes the 200 to 300 stories that we've collected over the previous 12 months, and they will vote to winnow that list of stories down to approximately 30 or so. And then the project forwards those 30 stories along to our panel of 28 expert judges, who are everyone from themselves news professionals, editors, reporters. We have a former FCC commissioner on our panel of experts.
Do you have anybody who's like a host of a show about journalism or anything like that? Because that seems like that'd be a natural fit.
Yeah, maybe we need to recruit.
I'm just spitballing here.
Yeah. Anyway, that panel of judges then votes to determine the final top 25 listing and the rank of those stories. Now, the list, as I say, is kind of a vehicle for the mission of the project. And every year I'm amazed at the stories that we come up with, things that you can't believe haven't received more coverage than they have. And each of those stories is important and worthy in its own right. But as a sociologist, part of my interest in the project and thinking about the history of the project, and in effect what amounts to now a database, if you will, a body of data that comprises more than 1,000 underreported but important news stories going back to the mid-'70s. And when you think about not the individual story, but the set of stories, you can begin to see patterns of corporate coverage, or more accurately, inadequate corporate coverage, right? And what I like to think of as the blind spots and the third rails and the no-go zones of the corporate media that become very clear, not just when you look at a single story or this year's collection of stories, but the entire archive of those stories. And those are all available on the Project Censored website, which is Project Censored, all one word, .org.
So we're gonna later in the show, or maybe we're gonna actually dedicate 2 shows to this topic, to talking to you. So maybe either later in the show or in the next episode, we're going to talk about individual stories from that are on this year's list. But as you point out, there is a tendency. The corporate media has tendencies that you have identified over the years, and it seems like it would be relatively simple to have certain stories that are would make your list every year. Poverty, the defense industry, just the war machine. Climate change is another that is certainly underreported. Criminal justice, problems with our criminal justice system. What's going on in Flint, Michigan. That might have been the first year, but now, it's still going on, and yet you hear nothing about it from the corporate media. So, how do you distinguish the ongoing, perennial, poorly covered stories like climate change in general to drill down to specific stories that are from that year in particular?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's an area where we would welcome even more people getting involved to help kind of research and document those kinds of things. Let me answer the question in 2 specific ways, though. One is we can talk about what we know from other research on news content and the kinds of stories that receive attention and those that do not. And here I want to invoke 2 kind of bodies of research findings. One arise from the work of Herman and Chomsky, the propaganda model as it's known, which famously identifies 5 filters And normally when we think of filters, we think of, oh, a filter makes something more pure and better. But the way Herman and Chomsky were talking about news filters, they were talking about social factors that remove from our view important news stories. So they were, among the filters are things like advertising and the corporate media's dependency on advertising for revenues and how that shapes news content. So a lot of the stories that do not get covered, that we at Project Censored try to bring to wider attention, the lack of coverage makes some sense when you think about them in terms of the Herman and Chomsky propaganda model and the idea of news that is filtered of dissident messages.
Or just the business model of a for-profit enterprise as as a news organization, that they know where their bread is buttered and you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you.
Yes, I mean, and that's a straightforward, almost commonsensical aspect that many people have documented in great detail. But another aspect of that propaganda model that I think is less widely appreciated, but that I certainly discuss with students in my sociology courses is news is filtered in terms of who reporters treat as important or newsworthy sources of information. And so one of the major differences between the corporate media and the independent press would be the diversity of people who are treated as newsworthy sources of information and perspective. And the overwhelming finding of literally decades of research on this in sociology and other disciplines is that when you look at what we call the corporate news, overwhelmingly reporters rely on official bureaucratic sources for what they consider newsworthy. And so that's very limiting. And I think one of the things I encourage students in my courses to do is to try looking at independent news media for a couple weeks or even a month and see if they aren't learning things that they would not learn from their typical news sources, in part because there's such a great so much greater diversity of sources in the independent press than there is in the corporate media. The other body of literature that I would suggest as being really useful to understanding the way that corporate media limit debate in the United States is what's known in communications as the indexing model. And the argument here, which goes back initially to studies of news coverage of the Vietnam and Iraq wars. The argument in the indexing model is that when it comes to international politics and foreign policy in particular, but I think this applies more generally, US reporters only report when there is a lack of consensus among elites. So, for instance, if there is congressional debate about a matter, then that will get attention and coverage in the corporate press. But as Project Censored began tracking several years ago, when for a variety of factors, there is little to no debate about, for instance, the United States use of drones around the world, including Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere, when there's not congressional debate about that, the index model suggests we won't find much in the way of news coverage on that topic. And that has been true with, by and large, for almost a decade now, with a few notable exceptions, namely in the independent media, and a few notable exceptions, people like Scott Shane and others at the New York Times and Washington Post. So those two models, the propaganda model, Herman and Chomsky, and the indexing model, I think provide some theoretical basis for understanding some of the broad social and political factors that limit the scope of coverage and the scope of debate in the coverage that we do get in the corporate press.
I remember growing up, and when I came of age politically, I started reading the New York Times because that's the paper of record, and I think I had absorbed the message that this was the news. if it's in the New York Times, it's the news, and the news, it's as if it came down from God himself and, it found itself on the New York Times. And I don't think I'm alone in that sort of feeling, whether it's CNN or New York Times or Washington Post or whatever the media outlet your of choice is. But that there's the news, and then there's stuff that isn't the news. And if it's in the New York Times, that qualifies. And reading Chomsky, reading Manufacturing Consent by Chomsky and Herman, this sort of revelation, like, no, these are individuals making decisions about what to cover, what not to cover, based on their own biases, based on their own incentives. And you often, not often, but occasionally you will see examples of someone going, as they say, off the reservation and doing a story that nobody else wants to cover, nobody else is going to cover. Gary Webb with the Dark Alliance and the Mercury News, San Jose Mercury News, a number of years ago is a good example. And how when you violate those factors that you were talking about, the index and the basic filters, that you dispense with those filters and you cover stories that others don't want covered, that official sources don't want covered, that not only do the other media outlets, the other corporate media outlets not support you and not cover it, they actually will attack you and criticize you, and they'll go after your reporting. And it's very instructive when these occasional, Phil Donahue on MSNBC, when he decided he was going to be against the Iraq War, when he was against the Iraq War, and MSNBC said, no, we have to be seen as supporting the war. So Phil Donahue, you have the best ratings at the network, but you're gone. So that realization that these are people making these choices, and the choices they make may not be based on what is newsworthy in my opinion as the recipient, and it's not even just these factors. It may be, to a degree, like the New York Times. The people who run and work at the New York Times come from traditionally an East Coast Ivy League elites, and the audience is also that composed of those similar people. So they're just serving the same audience, but they don't realize that they have this internal bias. They would say to you, we're just covering the stories we think are important. Nobody tells me what not to cover. Nobody tells me what I should and shouldn't cover. But you got hired because they knew what you would and wouldn't cover. And when you do step out of line, like Gary Webb did, then you're out, or Donahue or whoever. So. Would you agree? I mean, am I accurate that my perception of these matters is shared broadly by the American public about what is the news and what isn't?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned Gary Webb, and he's a really important figure to remember and to honor the legacy, his legacy. Of course, Gary Webb broke stories that about federal agencies' connections to drugs coming into inner cities, especially Los Angeles, and that reporting has held up very well over time. In fact, one of our Project Censored yearbooks a few years ago, we had a chapter by Brian Covert looking at the legacy of Gary Webb and basically concluding that he got the story right, but he was pilloried for that. He was pilloried for that by the corporate media. And Brian Covert documents that in detail too, and that chapter is available in I'm going to forget the year of that Project Censored book, but if people go to our website, I believe that chapter is posted online as well. It's by Brian Covert, Covert, who did an excellent job of documenting that, as he does in all his reporting. But broadly, I mean, going back to the bigger picture, I would say the one thing where I might qualify slightly what you say, Malcolm, would be to say that I believe, based on both experience and what I have read in the sociology of news production, that most journalists make a good faith effort to, in effect, bracket their politics in their reporting. And they are pursuing their reporting as a professional endeavor and not as a way of grinding a political axe or advancing an agenda. That is not to say, however, that their reporting or they are without biases. The difference is that the biases are not individual political biases, but they are organizational, institutional biases. And again, re-invoking the Herman and Chomsky propaganda model, the bias, the institutional organizational bias towards government officials and other bureaucratic sources shapes the news in ways that I personally believe are more fundamental than political divides between left and right, red and blue, et cetera. And I think that the most fundamental, in other words, the most fundamental bias that affects the kind of news we receive when we read the New York Times is an organizational, institutional bias for official bureaucratic sources. And that cuts across some of the conventional ways of understanding news bias in terms of Democrat versus Republican, liberal, conservative, and such. So in other words, sociologically speaking, any one individual reporter is playing a role in an organization, and what they can or cannot do individually is both constrained by that organization, which makes some things possible and other things impossible. And so I wouldn't be the first person on your show probably to describe the dynamic of self-censorship, where a reporter knows, and Phil Donahue has talked about this. We have a segment in the Project Censored documentary film where he talks about exactly this. A reporter knows that if they come again and again to an editor with a story that the editor isn't likely to run, that eventually they don't continue to have a viable career as a reporter.
Right. But it's not just the news business. That's any industry that you're in. You learn the ropes, and you learn how to go along to get along, and how things are done. You may come in idealistic about certain things or wanting to go your own way, but then you learn. Policing is an example. If you come in as you go into work for a police force, and you find you're working with people who are corrupt and who are on the take, and so on and so forth, you learn pretty quickly that you either have to go along or you're going to be on the outs, or police brutality is similar. But we're getting a little bit far afield. We're almost done with this segment. Before we do, I wanted to talk about one aspect of the news business that is relatively new, is the whole concept of so-called fake news. That you say that the Project Censored is about sort of a counter to the fake news, and it seems to me there are two elements of the phenomenon of fake news. One is where it originated as sort of these stories on Facebook that were completely fabricated and untrue, but intended to sway an audience to one position or another, to back Donald Trump or what have you, that were intended as fake news. And then there's the weaponizing of fake news, which is what Donald Trump does by saying that even legitimate news that he disagrees with or doesn't like, he calls that fake news. How does an organization that is oriented towards amplifying stories that are not covered sufficiently, how do you operate in a world where the fake news and just the concept of fake news is all around us and all consuming, and sort of sucks the oxygen out of the room in discussions of the media or news media business?
Right. Thank you. That's a great question and an important topic to address for sure. I think there are two steps, and Mickey Huff, the project's director, and I argue this point in the introduction to Censored 2019. I think there are two ways that you fight fake news. One is to doggedly, as you say at the outset of the program, to doggedly continue to point out instances of misinformation and disinformation, of false news, to point those out and to point to alternatives. So this is a focus on the contents of fake news, right? To call out false or misleading coverage and narratives. The other way we fight fake news is to address, in effect, what you could think of as the contexts of fake news. And this involves identifying and countering the kind of broader social, cultural, political contexts that that give rise to fake news in the first place. So how does something get labeled as fake news, right? Asking that question gets into the second part of what you were mentioning a moment ago, the way that Donald Trump and people in the Trump administration have kind of weaponized the concept of fake news, to use it to dismiss not just individual stories, but to dismiss reporters and indeed entire news organizations as if they are equivalent to false information. And going back to the roots of that is, I think, an important thing. So I would say, we have to be working. If we're fighting a fake news invasion, we have to be doing it on at least two levels. One, the contents of actual specific stories, and two, the context, the broader kind of social cultural factors that allow these stories to be created and circulated and to become compelling in the first place.
Well, I admire the work you guys do at projectcensored.org. For those who want to find out more, that's projectcensored.org. And I'm talking with Andy Roth. We're done. We're going to actually do 2 episodes, so we're wrapping up this one. But for next week's episode, we're going to get into actual stories that Project Censored has identified as some of the, we can't get into all 25 of them, but some of the stories that they have identified this past year as being the least covered yet still important stories. And we're going to talk about the dynamics in each and why they're important and why perhaps the corporate media isn't covering them sufficiently. So if you want to know more, stick around for next week's episode, come back. But for now, we're going to say goodbye to Andy Roth and then come back with him again next week. And shockingly enough, he and I are both going to be wearing the same clothes. So don't get suspicious at all. It's not fake news. Don't label us as such. But I wanted to thank Andy, and also, is there anything else people can do if they want to get involved and find out more? They can get the book. That's at projectcensored.org, I assume. But is that a catch-all location where they can get all the information about your organization and what you do?
Yep, and you can find us on social media as well. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and a little to a lesser extent on Twitter. But yeah.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. I'm looking forward to our conversation from next week, and finding out more about the current stories that qualify as top censored stories of the past year. But for now, thank you for watching at home. We appreciate it. Members make this show possible. You get to see this show before the general public, and that's one of the benefits of membership. We appreciate so much your being members. I'm Malcolm Fleschner. I'll see you next week.